The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous dirge as Elena Martinez moved through the ICU at St. Michael's Hospital in Atlanta, her footsteps barely disturbing the silence of the 2 a.m. shift. The night stretched before her like a taut wire, quiet on the surface, deadly if you weren't paying attention. She carried a tablet in one hand, medication charts glowing pale blue in the darkness, and her eyes held the kind of steady focus that came from having already survived the worst. Antiseptic and floor wax mingled in the air, that particular hospital smell that never quite faded no matter how long you'd been gone from this world. But Elena hadn't really gone anywhere. She'd just changed uniforms. Bed 12 held the Medivast Special Forces soldier from Helmand Province, his chest bandaged in layers of gauze that had been changed twice since his arrival 72 hours ago. Shrapnel wounds. That was the official designation. What it actually meant was that he'd been driving a Humvee when an IED detonated 40 meters away, and somehow, impossibly, he'd made it out. Elena approached his bedside with movements economical and precise, the way someone moves who understands that efficiency saves lives. She checked the chest tube first, her fingers finding the entry point at the 5th intercostal space without hesitation, without a single wasted motion. The bandaging was clean. Vitals stable. O2 sat 96%. Everything textbook. Everything wrong. She had been nursing for 14 years, also the fake credential file stated, but Elena Martinez had been something else for 12 years before that. In a different uniform. Under a different name. With a unit patch sewn into the lining of her jacket that read "First in, last out." She pulled the medication cart closer and began cross-referencing the soldier's cardiac medications against the pharmacy orders. Digoxin. Amiodarone. Lisinopril. All standard post-trauma management. All absolutely correct on paper. But the dosages in the system didn't match the dosages being administered. A 200 milligram difference in the amiodarone on Tuesday. A completely erased dose of digoxin on Wednesday. Small enough that the shift changes would obscure the discrepancies. Large enough that someone was doing this on purpose. Elena made notes in the leather journal she kept in her scrubs pocket, the one she was not supposed to have, the one that would be evidence of her investigation if anyone knew to look for it. She photographed 3 medication orders with her phone, the flash off, the images grainy in the low light. The soldier in bed 12 stirred slightly but didn't wake. She watched him for a moment, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of someone still in recovery, still fighting back from a hole that most people never climb out of. She knew the feeling. The break room was empty, as it always was at this hour. Elena hung her jacket on the back of a plastic chair and sat with her coffee, the cup lukewarm from sitting too long on the counter. The jacket was old, a relic from a deployment to Kandahar in 2012, the fabric worn soft from 3 years of field work and one catastrophic ambush that had cost her 3 of her best people. She'd never worn it to St. Michael's, too risky, too identifiable if someone started digging into her background. But she kept it in her locker anyway, the way people keep photographs of people who can't hurt them anymore. The unit patch was sewn into the lining at the inside collar, faded to the color of old denim, invisible unless you knew to look. First in, last out. The unofficial motto of her team. The truth she'd been living since 2009. She didn't flinch when Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway of the break room like something that had crawled out from under a rock. He was tall, expensive, the kind of man who wore cufflinks to a hospital where people bled all over everything. His eyes had that particular flatness that Elena recognized instantly, the look of someone counting his money in his head while talking to you. He'd been watching her. She knew it the way a predator knows it's being hunted by something faster. Late night. His voice was smooth, the kind of practiced courtesy that predators use before they strike. He held a coffee cup from the Starbucks on the ground floor, the one that cost $9 for a drink that tasted like burnt promises. Standard ICU rotation, Dr. Mercer. Elena didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The calculation was already complete. He was stealing from the patients. Pharmaceutical kickbacks, most likely. He was using the medication discrepancies as cover, billing insurance for dosages that never reached the bloodstream, pocketing the difference through some subsidiary supplier arrangement that probably had 17 layers of shell companies underneath it. The Pentagon had sent her to investigate 3 weeks ago. The medication deaths, that's what they'd called them in the briefing, had started 6 months ago. Patients who should have recovered. Patients who coded on cardiac meds that should have been saving their lives. 7 bodies so far. 7 families who thought their loved ones had simply lost the fight. You seem very focused on the medication charts. Dr. Mercer took a slow sip of his coffee, and Elena heard the smile in his voice without turning to look at him. That's not really standard nursing, is it? Most of our night shift staff don't spend quite so much time on pharmacy audits. Patient safety is standard. Her voice came out exactly as intended, deferential, soft, the way a nurse talks to a doctor who signs her paycheck and controls her schedule. The way a woman talks to a man who has all the power. She was very good at this particular fiction. She'd been trained by people who'd spent 6 months teaching her how to disappear into a role so completely that she became a ghost. Useful. Invisible. Safe. Of course. He set the coffee cup down on the counter beside her jacket, right next to the folded edge of denim where the unit patch pressed against the lining. But you know, we do have systems in place. Pharmacy performs those audits. Risk management oversees them. You're a nurse, not an auditor. I'd hate to see you exceed your scope of practice, Elena. That could create real problems. The way he said her first name was a threat wrapped in professionalism. It was the voice of a man who knew she was investigating him and was giving her one chance to stop. Elena turned to look at him then, meeting his eyes with the flat, arctic gaze that had made subordinates click their heels and follow her into situations where the probability of walking out alive had been calculated at approximately 30%. I understand, Dr. Mercer. She stood, picking up her jacket and tucking it under her arm. The patch hidden again. The secret sealed inside the lining. I'll stick to nursing. See that you do. He smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd just marked her for destruction. It would be tragic if someone as dedicated as you suddenly found herself dealing with credential issues. Those things have a way of following nurses around. Very difficult to recover from. Elena walked past him without another word, her spine straight, her shoulders level. Behind her, Dr. Mercer picked up his Starbucks and returned to the nurse's station, where he was likely already composing the first of several emails that would begin the process of dismantling her credibility. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know that the steadiness in her hands came from having performed emergency field medicine under fire, that the precision of her movements came from training that cost the United States military $8 million per soldier. He didn't know that the faded unit patch in her jacket belonged to a woman who'd been classified killed in action for 2 years while she trained to infiltrate civilian life. He'd made the calculation that Elena Martinez was a nurse asking dangerous questions. He'd made the calculation wrong. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that he'd just confirmed every suspicion Elena had carried into St. Michael's 3 weeks ago. He was guilty. And now he knew she knew. Which meant the clock was running on how long she had before he moved from passive intimidation to active sabotage. In her experience, men like Mercer didn't wait long before they struck. Men like Mercer didn't survive by being patient. They survived by eliminating the threat as quickly and efficiently as possible. Elena returned to bed 12 to check on her patient one final time before her shift ended at 7 a.m. The soldier's vitals remained stable. His EKG traced a steady rhythm across the monitor. His O2 sat at 97% now. He was healing the way a young man with years of trauma medicine training should heal, efficiently, pragmatically, refusing to fail. She adjusted his fluid rate by 2 milliliters per hour and made a note of the change in his chart. By the time the day shift arrived, everything would look absolutely normal. Everything would look like textbook recovery. She hung her jacket back in her locker and touched the patch through the fabric one more time before the shift change, before the day nurses arrived and the ICU filled with voices and purpose and the ordered chaos of people trying to save lives. The fluorescent lights continued their mechanical hum. The antiseptic smell settled into her clothes and her hair and her skin the way it always did. Elena Martinez returned to the nurse's station and began the meticulous task of documenting her night, recording every action, every observation, building the case that would eventually bring everything down. She didn't know yet that it would take 5 more hours. She didn't know yet that the next 5 hours would change everything. She only knew that Dr. Mercer had shown his hand, and that was exactly what she'd been waiting for. The rain started around 3 a.m., hammering against the hospital windows like applause for a performance only she understood was happening. Elena pulled her scrubs tighter and continued her work, steady and methodical, the way a captain commands a room, not by raising her voice, but by the absolute certainty that something dangerous had just been set in motion, and she was the only person in the building equipped to handle what came next. Morning rounds moved through St. Michael's like clockwork, Elena's shadow trailing Dr. Mercer through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and something underneath, fear, maybe, or the particular exhaustion that came from knowing too much about systems designed to fail quietly. She carried her tablet, her notes meticulous, her face a study in professional deference. The third-year resident beside them barely looked at the charts. The medical student took notes on everything except what mattered. Room for 08 held a man named William Vasquez, 73, post-op day from coronary artery bypass. His daughter sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed, dark circles under her eyes the way families get them when they've stopped sleeping in actual beds. The monitors showed normal sinus rhythm. Blood pressure stable. But the medication order on the screen made Elena's hands tighten against the tablet's smooth edge. Dr. Mercer, the cardiac glycoside order for Mr. Vasquez. Elena's voice came out exactly as it needed to, respectful, deferential, the voice of someone asking permission to breathe. The dose shows 750 micrograms. Standard post-op dosing is 250. The room went still in that particular way hospitals have when protocol meets challenge. Dr. Mercer turned slowly. His face was a mask of irritation, the kind doctors practiced for moments when nurses asked questions they weren't qualified to ask. His eyes moved from Elena to the family, calculating audience response like a man who understood that public humiliation required witnesses. "You question my orders." His voice came out smooth as polished glass, dangerous as broken edges hidden inside. In front of the family. "The dosage appears to be." "Appears." He said the word like she'd suggested the earth was flat. "You appear to lack the medical education to read a chart properly, Nurse Martinez." William Vasquez's daughter leaned forward, her hand gripping her father's arm. Elena saw the question forming in her eyes, the first crack in trust that had taken 4 days to build. This was the moment Mercer understood better than anyone, the moment when doubt bloomed like infection. Elena folded her hands. Spine straight. The way a captain stands at parade rest, muscles coiled but perfectly still. "I only meant to clarify the..." "Enough." Mercer turned away, dismissing her like she was equipment that had malfunctioned. "Continue with your duties, nurse." But that wasn't going to be the end of it, and Elena understood that too. Some men couldn't let challenges go. Some men had to make sure everyone in the building knew they'd been challenged, and won. 20 minutes later, the page came through her phone. Dr. Mercer requesting her presence in the hallway outside room for 12. Elena walked toward him with the same steady pace, the same measured breaths. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made skin look like something that should stay buried. Mercer was waiting with his arms crossed, his face arranged into an expression of profound disappointment, the expression of a man about to explain someone's fundamental inadequacy to a group of witnesses. Elena could see in 2 rooms for 10, 411, 413. Could see family members noticing the confrontation. Could see phones being angled, though no one was recording. Yet, "Your dangerous incompetence puts every patient on this floor at risk," he began, his voice pitched loud enough to carry, precisely calibrated to reach exactly 3 rooms without sounding like he was shouting. "You question orders you lack the education to understand. You are a liability this hospital cannot afford, and frankly, I'm astonished you passed your licensing exam at all." His voice had that quality, the voice of a man used to being obeyed, used to rooms that bent around his will like gravity. The muscles in Elena's jaw tightened, but her face remained still. Her eyes remained flat and cold as winter steel meeting a blank sky. She didn't defend herself. Didn't explain. Didn't let even a millimeter of reaction cross her features. The silence stretched for 3 seconds. Long enough for a breath. Long enough for humiliation to settle into everyone's ears like sediment. "You should have checked my references more carefully, Doctor." She turned with measured steps, each footfall deliberate against the tile floor, a sound like boots on concrete, like someone walking away from something permanently. Her spine stayed straight as a rifle barrel. She didn't look back. The corridor behind her stayed absolutely quiet, the way spaces get quiet when people realize they've witnessed something they don't quite understand. The break room at lunch smelled like someone's leftover fish and the particular staleness of institutional coffee that had been sitting in the pot since 6 a.m. Elena sat at the small table in the corner, her lunch tray in front of her, a sandwich she'd packed that morning, an apple from the stand downstairs, a container of yogurt. She opened her sandwich and began eating methodically. 20 chews per bite. A pattern. A rhythm. The kind of control that came from knowing that chaos lived one decision away and you had to fence it off with precision. For other nurses came in at 12:44. They saw her. Their eyes flickered like the monitors in the ICU, registered the data, processed it, decided the risk wasn't worth the interaction. They grabbed their lunches and left without a word, moving toward the other break room on the east wing. Tables could be empty. Spaces could be cleared. A person sitting alone could be made invisible through the simple mechanics of collective avoidance. Elena chewed each bite exactly the right number of times. The write-up was pinned to the unit board at 3 p.m., positioned where everyone would see it on their way to the supply closet. The paper was institutional beige, the lettering in that particular aggressive sans serif font that hospitals used for things that ended careers. Disciplinary action, insubordination and medication protocol violations, Elena Martinez RN. The date. The time. The witness signatures. Everything official enough to start gathering weight immediately, the way these things did. By tomorrow, people would be saying she'd been documented. By next week, they'd be saying she'd been warned. By the month after, they wouldn't remember what she'd actually done, only that she'd been marked. Elena read every word. Her jaw tightened enough to show the muscle beneath her skin, a single tell she allowed herself because no one was looking. She removed the paper from the board with a motion that was almost gentle, folded it precisely into quarters, and placed it in her scrub pocket. That's when she became aware of Dr. Mercer standing 6 feet away, coffee cup in hand, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth like he was watching a show that had exceeded his expectations. His expression held the particular satisfaction of a man who understood that power wasn't about being right, it was about being in a position where you didn't have to be. Where you could be reckless and the system would still catch you. Elena met his eyes. Held them. Said nothing. The flatness in her gaze must have communicated something that registered because his smile faltered, tightened, transformed into something that looked less like victory and more like the beginning of doubt. For just a moment, his hand twitched toward the coffee cup like he needed something to do with his expression. Then Elena turned and walked back to the unit, the folded paper pressing against her ribs like a secret. The soldier in bed 12, call sign reacher, medic by training, survivor by temperament, had watched the entire thing from his bed. His chest was still wrapped in bandages, his breathing still coming carefully because shrapnel wounds didn't forget their damage. But his eyes had tracked Elena's movements, had registered the confrontation in the hallway, had processed the moment when she folded the write-up and pocketed it like she was collecting evidence of something. When she came in to check his vitals at 4 p.m., his voice came out rough from the pain medication but clear underneath. You know what he did, don't you? Elena's hands didn't pause as she checked the monitor leads. Rest, Sergeant. Your oxygen saturation is dropping again. That's not what I asked you. She met his eyes briefly, a single moment of connection that felt like recognition, though he couldn't possibly know. Not yet. Don't start a fight you can't finish from that bed. But that was the problem. The fight had already started. Elena could feel it moving beneath the surface of St. Michael's like something breathing underneath the floorboards. By 2 a.m., everything would come to the point of breaking. By the time the sun rose, someone was going to understand exactly what they'd been standing next to all along. The rain started again around 10 p.m., hammering against the windows of the third-floor hallway like applause for a performance only Elena understood had already reached its climax. She moved through the hospital the way water moves through a system designed to contain it, inevitable, patient, and with the absolute certainty that pressure was building toward something that couldn't be stopped anymore. At 2 a.m., the monitors screamed. Not a warning beep. A flatline shriek that split the darkness of the ICU like a blade through silk. The soldier's chest tube had dislodged, blood pooling under the sheets in a dark spreading stain. His O2 sat collapsing like a building mid-demolition. 92, 84. 71. The attending surgeon, Dr. Kelvin Hayes, stood at the foot of the bed with his hands frozen at chest height. The resident beside him opened her mouth. Closed it. The respiratory therapist checked the ventilator settings twice, then a third time, as if numbers might rearrange themselves into sense. Nobody moved. Elena was 2 rooms away when she heard it. She'd been checking a post-op cardiac patient's rhythm strip, routine work, invisible work, the kind of work that got swallowed by the machinery and forgotten by morning. She read the EKG like others read a headline. She moved. No hesitation. No permission asked. The crash cart was already there, wheeled by a nurse who understood that presence alone wasn't action. Elena pushed past them into the center of the code, her hands already moving to the soldier's chest, assessing the dislodged line, the hemorrhage, the mathematics of how many minutes before his blood pressure hit 0. She didn't speak until she knew exactly what she was seeing. Then her voice dropped into the register that came from somewhere deeper than lungs. Somewhere that had been forged in Helmand Province under fire, intense with no surgical suite, with nothing but field supplies and the absolute certainty that hesitation killed. Get me an 18-gauge needle. Chest decompression, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Now. The attending surgeon blinked. We should wait for. He has for minutes. Maybe less. She didn't look at him. Her hands were already unwrapping the sterile field. The tube is gone. His left lung is collapsed. His heart rate is 136. His pressure is dropping. Move. Something in her voice, not the words, but the architecture beneath them, the absolute command that carried no negotiation, made everyone obey. The needle appeared in her palm. She palmed the soldier's chest, found the landmarks with the accuracy of someone who'd done this in darkness, in rain, in the back of a Chinook that wouldn't stop moving. The needle went in. A hiss of air escaping. Pressure releasing. The monitor's scream became a gasp, then a rhythm. O2 climbing. 65, 73. 81. But there was still hemorrhage. The dislodged line had nicked something deeper. Elena pulled a scalpel from the crash cart with the same motion she'd used to draw a breath. The blade caught the fluorescent light like a signal. Get me suction. Saline bolus running wide open. I need the attending at my shoulder. Everyone else, step back 3 paces. The attending surgeon, 6 months of confidence, 17 years of training, eyes that had never seen anything worse than a teaching hospital, stepped forward instead. His name was Dr. Raymond Sterling, and in that moment, he made the correct choice. He said nothing. He positioned himself where Elena's voice had placed him and waited to see what a human being with actual combat experience looked like when the illusion of choice was stripped away. Elena opened the chest. Not a request. Not a procedure performed by committee. She made the incision through the 4th intercostal space, her blade moving with the precision of a weapon being handled by someone who understood that grace under pressure was the only currency that mattered. Her hands weren't trembling. They were steady in the way that water becomes steady at depth, in the way that things that have learned to survive stop fearing what might happen next. The rib spread. The lung collapsed backward like a petal. There was the bleeder, a small laceration in the pulmonary artery, nothing massive, nothing impossible, just a problem that needed solving with speed and certainty. Satin sky clamp. Small one. She had it before she finished the sentence. The clamp went on. The bleeding stopped. O2 climbing again. 85, 92. 98. The soldier's eyes opened then, not with consciousness but with something closer to recognition. His lips moved. The word that came out was fragmented, broken by the ventilator tube, "Captain." Elena didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her eyes met his for exactly 1 second, a conversation that lasted in the space between heartbeats, and then she was already speaking orders, already moving to pack the wound, to get a chest x-ray, to get him upstairs to the OR because this was temporary stabilization, not permanent fix. The attending surgeon, Dr. Sterling, watched her work and understood 3 things in sequence. First, that he was watching someone who had trained for this in conditions he couldn't imagine. Second, that he should step back and let her finish. And third, that the hierarchy in this room had just reorganized itself around someone whose credentials weren't hanging on a wall. By 7 a.m., the incident reports had already begun arriving. The first one hit her inbox at 6:36 a.m., Dr. Mercer's handwriting, typed in the clinical language of someone who'd spent the night documenting a case against her. The subject line read, "Incident report, scope of practice violation, case the 17th of March, 2024. The text was a taxonomy of her crimes. Unauthorized thoracotomy. Performing surgical procedures without licensure. Operating outside the scope of practice defined by Hospital Policy 3.7.2. Failure to follow chain of command. Administering commands to senior physicians." Elena read it the way she read an ambush, cataloging the angles, understanding the intent, measuring the distance to her own exit. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Mercer had copied the entire hospital administration. The chief medical officer. The director of risk management. The general counsel. And a name Elena had been dreading since the moment the attending surgeon stepped back, the Georgia Medical Board. Not an internal memo. Not a conversation to be had behind closed doors. A formal incident report that was already becoming permanent infrastructure, a paper trail that would be pulled if anyone looked too hard, a documentation of everything she'd done. There were photographs. She didn't know who'd taken them, probably the resident with the frozen expression, probably someone documenting for risk management, but there were stills from the code. Her hands on the soldier's chest. The scalpel in her grip. The thoracotomy spread open like an accusation. All of it labeled, dated, annotated with Mercer's clinical commentary, unauthorized surgical procedure performed by nursing staff. No physician supervision. Direct violation of hospital bylaws. Recommend immediate action. She sat at the nurse's station with the monitor brightness turned low, coffee going cold in a cup beside her laptop, reading the methodical architecture of her own destruction. Mercer had documented everything. Every time she'd questioned a medication order. Every time she'd accessed patient records outside her assigned patients. Every moment she'd pushed back, spoken up, asked the wrong questions. He'd built a case with bureaucratic precision, each incident a brick, each violation a support beam, until the whole structure was standing and ready to crush her. At 8:51 a.m., Elena tried to log into the pharmacy database. Her access was already disabled. The system prompted her, user credentials invalid. Please contact IT support. She sat there for 15 seconds, staring at the error message, understanding exactly what it meant. Mercer had moved fast. Had called someone. Had used the infrastructure of the hospital the way a general uses terrain, not as landscape, but as a weapon. By the time she'd finished documenting her own heroics, her own credentials were being systematically removed from every system that mattered. She needed to download the evidence. The discrepancies in medication orders. The pharmacy audit trail. The records of every patient whose cardiac dosage had been altered, every prescription that didn't align with clinical indication. That was the real mission. That was what she'd come here to prove. But the door to the pharmacy database was already closed, already locked, already sealed behind a wall of permissions that no longer belonged to her. At 9:15 a.m., she tried to meet with the hospital administrator. Her badge no longer opened that door. Security was already there, not threatening, but present, a physical reminder that the institution had decided where Elena belonged. Not in the executive offices. Not asking questions. Not anymore. By 11:44 a.m., her shift supervisor received orders from Human Resources. Elena was being escorted out. Immediately. No final rounds. No goodbyes. Just a cardboard box and the sound of her own heartbeat in the silence that followed. At noon, 2 security guards, young men who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, walked with Elena to her locker. They didn't touch her. They didn't speak. They just stood there while she packed the small evidence of a life that had fit into this space. A cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded lettering. A half-dead succulent that she'd watered exactly 4 times despite its clear desire to be left alone. And a photograph in a plastic frame, her unit before the ambush. Before Kandahar. Before 3 of the names in that photo stopped being pronounced aloud. She looked at the photograph for maybe 3 seconds. Then she put it in the box. The walk through the ICU was the longest distance she'd traveled all week. Every step felt like it was being measured by someone, counted against her, added to the list of things that needed explaining. The soldier in bed 12 was awake now, more awake than he'd been since he arrived, his oxygen saturation climbing toward normal, his systolic pressure holding at 112. He tried to sit up when he saw her. His nurse held him down gently, following protocol, following the hierarchy that had reasserted itself in daylight. Elena didn't look at the soldier. She kept walking. She didn't stop at the nurse's station. She didn't acknowledge Mercer, who was standing near the medication cart with an expression of practiced concern. She simply walked through the double doors, down the hallway, past the waiting room where visitors sat hunched under the weight of hospital visits, and out into the Atlanta morning where the rain had finally stopped and the sun was doing its best to convince everyone that this was just another day. The cardboard box was heavier than it should have been. The cardboard box felt heavier with each step away from St. Michael's, though Elena knew the weight wasn't physical. Inside, the cracked mug rattled against the half-dead succulent. The photo lay on top, her unit before Kandahar, for faces smiling in the Helmand Province sun. 3 of them were gone now. She stood at the bus stop on Peachtree Street, rain hammering down like machine gun fire on a metal roof, soaking through her scrubs and into her skin. Water dripped from her hair. Her combat boots, hidden under civilian clothes for 18 months, were sodden. The succulent tilted sideways in its pot, leaves browning at the edges like everything in her life right now. Mission failed. Cover blown. Investigation dead in the water. Mercer had won. He sat in that hospital right now, probably in the administration conference room, presenting his incident reports like a prosecutor building a case. She could picture his smile, the arrogant certainty of a man who didn't understand that removing a chess piece didn't mean the game was over. It meant the opponent was about to move in ways he'd never anticipated. But Elena didn't have an opponent anymore. She had nothing. No credentials. No access. No authority to continue investigating the medication deaths that had been accumulating in St. Michael's like bodies in a mass grave. 18 patients over 32 months. Mercer had been systematically poisoning them through deliberately falsified cardiac dosages, turning their own medications into weapons, all while pharmaceutical kickback money flowed into offshore accounts. She'd been embedded for this. Military intelligence had placed her inside St. Michael's specifically because her nursing credentials were ironclad, because she'd actually served as a combat medic for 12 years before the Pentagon asked her to try something different. And now she was standing in the rain with a dying plant. Headlights cut through the downpour like searchlights. A car screeched to a stop at the curb, tires hydroplaning on wet asphalt. The driver's side door flew open and her teenage son Miguel ran toward her, 16 years old and soaking wet, clutching a shadow box against his chest like it was made of glass. "Mom," he gasped, breathless. "They need to see these. You can't let him win." Inside the shadow box, medals and ribbons were arranged in precise military order. A silver star caught the streetlight. A purple heart below it. 2 bronze stars. A combat action badge. Elena's hands went cold. Miguel, no. What? How did you? Grandma's house. The closet you thought nobody knew about. All the photos. The commendation letters. He held the box higher. The real ones. Elena shook her head, stepping back. Water splashed around her boots. It's over. The mission is finished. We can't. The mission was to protect people, Miguel said, and his voice sounded exactly like hers had sounded in Helmand Province, calm and absolute. You're still protecting people. Come on. He grabbed her hand. His grip was strong. She'd taught him how to grip, how to move, how to stay calm when everything was breaking apart. She wanted to pull away. She wanted to tell him that some wars were already lost, that knowing when to retreat was wisdom, not cowardice. But Miguel's eyes held hers for exactly 2 seconds, and then he pulled her back toward the hospital entrance. They ran through the rain together, Miguel clutching the shadow box against his chest like armor. Inside St. Michael's, the ICU corridor was silent except for the hiss of ventilators and the steady beep of cardiac monitors. Elena's wet footprints marked their passage down the hallway. She could hear voices from the conference room, Mercer's voice, smooth and confident, presenting his case to the hospital administration like a defense attorney closing arguments in a courtroom. The conference room door slammed open. Miguel burst in, dripping wet, rain pooling under his feet on the tile floor. He walked straight to the conference table and dropped the shadow box in the center, scattering medals across Mercer's incident reports. A silver star skidded across a page marked Incident Report, Unauthorized Surgical Procedure. A purple heart landed on top of his typed signature. Dr. Mercer stood up. His mouth opened. No sound came out. The hospital administrator stared at the medals like they were evidence at a crime scene. The compliance officer started taking photographs with her phone. A legal representative began writing something on a notepad with a pen that shook slightly in his hand. Then they heard it, a voice from the ICU beds behind them. Reaper 6. The soldier in bed 12 was sitting up now, despite the chest tubes, despite the 4 lines, despite everything that should have kept him flat on his back. His eyes were locked on Elena's face. Recognition. The kind that came from shared combat, from watching someone perform surgery under fire with the calm precision of a seasoned operator. Mercer laughed. The sound was harsh, dismissive, the laughter of a man who still believed he controlled the narrative. This is absurd. She's a nurse with fabricated credentials and now a delusional child with costume jewelry. The Marine in the next bed, Elena hadn't registered him when she'd been focused on the soldier, pulled himself upright and reached for the shadow box. He was Special Forces too. She could see it in the way he moved, in the way his eyes scanned the room before settling on her. He lifted the silver star and read the citation aloud, his voice steady and clear. For extraordinary heroism in Helmand Province, Captain Elena Martinez led a rescue operation under heavy fire, extracted 7 wounded personnel, and held a defensive position against superior enemy forces. Mercer cut him off with a wave of his hand. Anyone can purchase medals online. This doesn't change the fact that she violated medical law, exceeded her scope of practice, and endangered a patient. His voice was still confident. Still mocking. Still absolutely certain of his position. That was the moment the ICU doors opened. A 2-star general walked in. He'd been visiting the VA ward next door, hadn't been part of this hospital's world at all, but the moment his eyes landed on the shadow box, his entire posture changed. His back straightened like a spine aligning to true north. He read the silver star citation. Then he read the purple heart. His jaw tightened. He walked directly to Elena and gave her a slow, crisp salute. Fist to chest. The kind of salute given by commanders to officers they've served within the field. The kind of salute that acknowledged everything Mercer had tried to destroy in one gesture. The hospital administrator's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. A nurse gasped. Dr. Mercer's face lost color, blood draining away until his skin looked like hospital walls, pale and institutional and utterly diminished. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "She's just a nurse." The general didn't even look at him. "Captain Martinez is one of the finest officers I've ever served with. I want to know what she's doing being escorted out of this hospital." Mercer opened his mouth but no sound emerged. The confidence he'd carried for months was evaporating like rain on hot asphalt. He turned to the hospital administrator. "Sir, I can explain. The incident reports." Nobody was listening. Exactly 5 hours after Elena had performed the emergency thoracotomy with a field blade and her hands moving on their own, a man in a dark suit walked into St. Michael's ICU, showed Pentagon credentials to security, and asked for Dr. Mercer by name. His ID read Special Agent Thomas Holloway, Defense Criminal Investigative Service. The room held its breath as he spoke. "Dr. Mercer, you're suspended from practice effective immediately pending a full federal investigation," Holloway said. His voice was the kind of calm that came from holding someone's entire future in his hands. "Captain Elena Martinez was embedded here by military intelligence to investigate suspicious patient deaths and medication tampering. Her evidence collection was meticulous. However, your own documentation trail has been even more useful." Holloway laid a folder on the conference table. "Every incident report you filed. Every pharmacy audit you demanded to discredit Captain Martinez. Every single action you took to undermine her has flagged every fraudulent prescription and kickback payment in your system. You handed us everything we needed to prosecute you. Federal counts. State counts. Insurance fraud. Conspiracy with pharmaceutical suppliers. Endangering patients through deliberate negligence." The hospital administrator backed away from Mercer like he was contagious. "The offshore account in Grand Cayman? We found it. The pharmaceutical rep who's been transferring you $150,000 per month. He's already agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. Your medical license is suspended as of now. The U.S. Attorney's Office will be filing charges within 72 hours. Mercer sat down slowly, as if his legs had stopped supporting him. His mouth moved but nothing came out. The man who had orchestrated Elena's humiliation, who had filed incident reports to destroy her, who had been so certain of his victory, had just watched his entire world collapse in 5 hours. Elena stood at the edge of the ICU, rain still dripping from her hair onto the tile floor. Miguel moved beside her, the shadow box now empty, its contents scattered across evidence tables that would be photographed by federal investigators. The soldier in bed 12 met her eyes and nodded once. The Marine beside him did the same. She needed a break. She needed Jell-O and coffee and about 16 hours of sleep. But what she said, quietly, to no one in particular, was, "Mission accomplished." The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm above her head. Outside the ICU windows, the Atlanta sky was clearing. Rain was stopping. Sun was starting to break through clouds like a slow recovery beginning. Elena picked up the shadow box from the table and held it against her chest, and for the first time in 5 hours, she allowed herself to breathe. Miguel burst through the ICU doors like a man carrying proof of a lie, shadow box held overhead, the afternoon light catching the glass at an angle that made the metal's inside glow with the kind of shine that only comes from decades of service. The conference room fell silent. Administrators mid-sentence stopped talking. Mercer's hand froze around his water bottle. The soldier in bed 12, the one Elena had pulled back from the edge of nothing, his eyes went wide and he pushed himself up on his elbows, tubes stretching, machines protesting, and his voice came out in a rasp that had nothing to do with the chest tube she'd guided back into his ribs hours earlier. "Reaper 6. 2 words. That was all. But they landed in that room like artillery." Elena felt the shadow box before she saw it hit the conference table. The glass didn't shatter, it was reinforced, built to travel, built to survive. Just like everything else in that room except Mercer. The medals inside caught the fluorescent light the way medals do when they mean something real. Bronze star. Silver star. 2 purple hearts in their ribbons. And one more that was still hidden, turned inward, waiting. The general came through the door like the weather changing. Not walked. Came. He was visiting the VA ward next door, a 2-star, shoulders broad enough to block the hallway, grey threading through his uniform like history. His eyes tracked down to the shadow box, then up to Elena, and something in his face shifted from routine hospital visit to witnessing. He moved toward her with the kind of precision that only comes from 35 years of knowing exactly where every body in a room was positioned. Then he stopped 3 feet from her. His hand came up, not a handshake. A salute. Slow. Crisp. Military perfect. His eyes never left her silver star, her purple hearts, the badges of pain and valor that Mercer had dismissed as fabricated credentials 5 hours earlier. Captain Martinez. His voice like a tank idling in a garage, full authority running at idle. I had the honor of serving under your battalion commander in 2015. General Patrick Halloway. He's still talking about Sanjin Valley. The room temperature dropped. Nobody breathed. Mercer's lawyer, who'd been standing quietly in the corner waiting for the hospital administrator to call, started typing something urgent into his phone. The Pentagon investigator walked in while the general was still saluting. Not a man. A woman. Colonel rank on her collar, Cybersecurity Division, the kind of face that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment since early morning when Elena's name had crossed her desk in a file marked Operation Catalyst. She carried a tablet. She moved to the conference table without asking permission and opened a video file. Then she looked directly at Mercer. Dr. Raymond Mercer. You've been flagged in a Department of Defense audit initiated 6 months ago. We were investigating medication tampering in military medical referrals. Captain Martinez was embedded here as part of that investigation. The colonel's voice could cut bone. The incident reports you filed against her? They were gold. Every single one. You documented your own fraud without understanding it. Mercer's face went pale the way faces do when the ground disappears. The colonel continued, and her words came like a chronological execution. Every medication discrepancy Captain Martinez reported and photographed traces back to your orders. The dosage adjustments that didn't match standard cardiac protocols. The kickback payments from Sandstone Pharmaceutical totaling $340,000 annually. The 3 patient deaths in 2019 that were attributed to natural causes but were actually the result of medications prescribed in doses that were deliberately elevated beyond therapeutic ranges. She turned the tablet toward the table. Financial documents appeared. Prescription records. Electronic signatures. A trail of corruption so complete it looked like a confession. The State Medical Board received an anonymous tip about medication discrepancies on your unit. The colonel's eyes moved to Elena. That would be Captain Martinez. She was inside your operation, documenting everything, following a protocol that predates your hiring. While you were building your kickback scheme, she was photographing evidence. While you were humiliating staff, she was documenting witness statements. While you were filing incident reports against her, you were filing detailed documentation of your own crimes. Dr. Mercer's voice cracked like old leather. This is, I was protecting the hospital from, she was performing surgery without, he stopped. Started again. I've been here 15 years. I'm the senior attending physician. I have board certifications, I have. You have nothing. The general's voice cut through his words like a blade. Captain Martinez has been in combat zones for 8 years. She saved more lives before breakfast than you'll see in your career. And she did it while undercover, while you were destroying her professionally, while your actions were actively harming patients. Your board certifications mean nothing when the board learns what you've done. The hospital administrator stood up slowly. Security was already moving toward Mercer, but they didn't need to rush. He knew. That moment when a man understands that every door is closing at once, Elena recognized it. She'd seen it in interrogation rooms. She'd seen it in the eyes of men who understood that power was temporary and consequences were permanent. "Dr. Mercer, your privileges are suspended immediately pending investigation by federal authorities." The administrator's voice was hollow with the weight of knowing what this would mean for St. Michael's reputation. "Security will escort you from the building." Mercer stood up. His briefcase was on the floor. He grabbed it like it was armor. He moved toward the door that had been his to open every morning for 15 years. His badge swiped across the access point. Nothing happened. His badge didn't work. Security had already locked him out of the system. One of the security officers had to manually unlock the door from the outside. Everyone watched him walk into the hallway. Elena could see him through the window that overlooked the parking lot, standing in the rain that had soaked her an hour earlier, that same rain that now seemed to be washing away something he couldn't get back. His phone rang. Then rang again. Then again. By the time he reached his car, the board had already called. By the time he got home, his wife had gotten the message through the hospital grapevine. By midnight, the Georgia Medical Board had suspended his license pending criminal investigation. By week's end, the DEA was executing a search warrant on his home office. By the time 30 days had passed, Dr. Raymond Mercer was no longer a doctor. He was a man driving a medical supply van for a prison healthcare contractor, delivering gauze and syringes to the same system that would eventually house him for fraud and endangerment. But that wasn't the final image that would matter. 6 months later, Elena stood in the rose garden in her dress uniform, the sun bright after so many months of fluorescent lights and institutional ceilings, and the President of the United States pinned a Presidential Citizen's Medal to her chest while cameras flashed and generals saluted, and the crowd of people she'd served with, both in uniform and undercovers, watched with the kind of pride that only comes from witnessing someone reclaim what was taken from them. Her rank was back. Captain Elena Martinez, U.S. Army Special Forces, recognized for extraordinary service in military and civilian capacities, for conducting a dangerous investigation that exposed systemic corruption and saved countless lives from a man who'd weaponized his position. Miguel stood in the front row wearing her old combat jacket, the sleeves rolled up because he hadn't grown into them yet, his fingers tracing the faded unit patch she'd sewn into the lining years ago, the one that read "First in, last out." Through the White House windows, Elena could see the reflection of the gathered crowd, her soldiers, the veteran she'd saved in bed 12 now standing in his own dress uniform, the Marine who'd recognized her, the general who'd validated her service in front of Mercer's entire house of cards. The president asked her to say a few words. Elena stepped to the microphone. The sun was warm on her face. The microphone smelled faintly of Polish and formality. She could hear the quietness of 1,000 people waiting to hear from a woman who'd been called incompetent, who'd been fired, who'd been forced to stand alone in the rain. "I was taught that rank is temporary but character is permanent," Elena said, her voice steady and carrying the weight of every decision she'd made, every one that had cost her something, every one that had saved someone. Dr. Mercer had the title, the position, the authority. But he forgot what it all meant. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. She looked directly at Miguel. "My son reminded me that truth doesn't hide forever. It just takes the right people looking for it. Thank you for seeing what was right in front of you." The soldier from bed 12 saluted first. The Marine who'd read her citation saluted. The general saluted. The nurses from St. Michael's, every single one, stood at attention. And Elena Martinez saluted back, her hand crisp, her bearing perfect, her identity fully restored and witnessed by everyone who mattered. If you found this story about the quiet warrior and the system that tried to bury her, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value?